Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're watching Canada Today on Muslim Network TV. Canada Today is a special Canadian focus segment on Muslim Network TV, and you are watching Taha Ghayur as your host. It is said that the greatest good you can do for another is not just by sharing your riches, but by revealing to him his own riches, his own talents and skills, and enabling somebody else. And this is with that spirit today. I'm actually going to be introducing to you a Muslim change maker who has a very interesting and unique story and a contribution that we wanted to highlight. We were going to be speaking with a change maker who has gone through various obstacles and has taken advantage of his unique background and skills, creative skills, to make change happen in not only just his own communities, but Canada-wide. Today, we're going to be talking with Aatif Baskanderi. He is the CEO of Northpine Foundation and a co-founder of Salaam B'y, a social enterprise that he built with his wife, and he who is also a health equity advocate, Dr. Nazia Sharafuddin. Aatif is a fellow with Energy Futures Lab and a member of the Next 30 Possibility panel. He is also the recipient of Memorial University Alumni Tribune Horizon Award and inaugural Global Newfoundland Community Champion Award. Aatif joins us with a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering, 2 master's degrees in technology management and social policy and development from London School of Economics and Political Science. So welcome, Aatif, to Canada Today for the first time, and we look forward to having a great conversation with you.
Assalamu alaikum, Taha. So happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, mashallah, you are an inspiring change maker, and we're going to hear quite a bit about your various hats that you wear and you have worn in the recent past. You have been involved in multiple diversity, inclusion, and artistic projects that have made some positive impact and waves across Canada. So before we get into all the awesome stuff you have been doing, I wanted to hear from you about yourself, your story, and your career path that you've taken over the past, couple of decades.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I mean, it starts from being a son of 2 amazing Pakistani immigrants to Canada. God bless my parents. Born in Ontario, but moved to Newfoundland at a young age, being 5 years old, and pretty much grew up in Newfoundland. And my whole life, we've kind of moved around Canada as my parents changed jobs. And that kind of sets a trajectory up for the rest of my life, where I've moved around Canada, moved around the world for many different positions. So I've kind of gone everything from engineering to international development to nonprofit work, working at startups, working with governments, kind of everything in between. But it's always been driven by those values that my parents and my faith and community have instilled in me, of just trying to do the right thing as best as I can. So that's, kind of my trajectory.
Interesting. I mean, knowing what you do now, I wonder if you chose engineering as a profession, by choice, or it's something that you probably did because your parents told you to do. I mean, I'm curious to know that, because I'm so intrigued to see the wonderful creative and community impact-based projects you're doing, and not that you're not making an impact with your engineering degree today and all the amazing background career that you actually have, career path that you've chosen for yourself. But I wonder if your engineering background helps you with what you are doing today, and helps you who you are today.
Yeah, so my father at a young age was a refugee, and education was his way of getting success. So while he grew up in Pakistan, he moved away to university, where he went to Japan. And that was really like the way education was that pathway to a better life. And then he ended up in Canada. So the one thing, actually, it's funny, my parents have never, ever pushed anything on me or my siblings. The only thing that they pushed on us is you should be excellent at what you do and invest sincerity and drive into it, whatever it is that you're doing. They just want to see that drive. So when it came to engineering, I'm just a giant nerd. Like, I am just a giant tech geek. Growing up, I loved it. I was that kid who was picking apart old computers just to see what was inside. I'm a Trekkie. I'm obsessed with Star Trek: The Next Generation. There's all these things about engineering I found so fascinating. And I used to love math and physics in school. And the interesting thing was, the only thing that I loved more than math and physics was actually social studies. And I've always been keen on learning about society, learning about social history, and especially social justice. So trying to find the intersection between engineering and social justice is something that I've always been driven to do.
Wow, what an interesting combination, and you certainly have shown us that. So that's like amazing. And you were recently awarded with the Horizon Award from Memorial University, and this award is for exceptional achievements that you have, of course, made. You're the recipient of this award based on your desire to serve the greater good for humanity through activism and creativity. Now, this is, of course, has a lot to do with your work as a co-creator of an award-winning social enterprise and documentary called Salaam B'y, a story of a Muslim Newfoundlander. So please tell us, from an engineering background, a person who grew up in Newfoundland, and who happens to be Muslim, why was this important for you to tell this story, and why was this so important for you to actually do it in this fashion?
Yeah, so Salaam B'y is something that was co-created with myself and my wife. So here I am, this engineer, and my wife is a physician. We have zero background in filmmaking, but we're both very passionate about storytelling. So of course, we all remember in 2016 when the election happened in the US and Donald Trump winning, and the rise in Islamophobia and racism that we saw. And Canada, hands down, is not immune to that. We own our very own special brand of Islamophobia and racism as well. So as we started to see these things percolating, I even started noticing it come up, like discussions like this come up in Newfoundland, which is where I grew up. And that was something that struck me in nausea. And the other piece is, as much as I saw discussions coming up that were Islamophobic, I also saw this other discussion happening, which would also be pointing at people who are in rural communities, that all of a sudden, if you come from rural Canada, people would associate you to being a racist or hosting XYZ prejudice, which was another thing that didn't really jive with me, because I did not see that growing up in a rural community. I mean, I grew up in Glanville, Newfoundland, population of about 4,000 people, pretty big in Newfoundland standards, but of course pretty small for everywhere else. And that's why we wanted to tell this story, is we basically wanted to cut through the noise and just talk about, well, what was it about my life when I grew up in this inclusive environment surrounded by non-Muslims actually enabled me to practice my Islam in a way that made sense to me, and an appreciation for that. So my wife and I have been doing social justice work for quite some time. And as we started on this journey, it's been an amazing journey so far. Like we said, we had no background in this, and kind of going from starting off from a Facebook blog post, turning into a speaking tour, which then turned into a film, which then turned into a film tour, and which then turned into an education social enterprise. It's been a pretty wild ride.
Wow, it certainly must be, and I think and we'll actually talk about this without me getting into this, but I think it's interesting how your story actually spoke so well and so personally to many people. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, your documentary, basically, it seems that it has opened hearts to many people. It opens many minds and hearts. Let's put it this way. And it has toured throughout the film industry, including with the United Nations and Parliament Hill. You won multiple awards, including the interfaith efforts, which were actually recognized by the Queen Elizabeth the second. And in fact, if correct me if I'm wrong, you're the third Canadian ever to be recognized for this specific role by the Queen among all the Commonwealth countries. So there are a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. One was, tell us about the writing process and the filming process. And as you mentioned, you have never done this before. So what did it take you to tell this story? And then I want to hear from you about the impact of this story. So first, let's hear from you about how did what did it take? How long did it take? And what were some challenges you guys faced when you did this story?
Yeah, so for anyone who has any family members who are doctors, you're probably familiar with, people being medical residents and resident physicians working extremely long hours. So essentially, one day when Nazia was on a 26-hour shift in the hospital, I got bored and I just started writing. I just basically opened up a Google Doc and just started writing out my whole story of growing up in Newfoundland. And it was an interesting process to go through. It was a lot of self-reflection, a lot of teasing out and extracting memories that I had and turning it into a story. I remember after I kind of took all these notes in my head and put them down into bullet points on a piece of paper, I think I had like 30 pages of just bullet points of just memories that I had growing up. And then from that, is when I tried to synthesize it into a story of like, what is it that I'm really trying to say here? And there's another interesting piece of the writing process when we talk about doing social justice writing. I actually phoned up a bunch of my friends who grew up as different minority groups in Newfoundland. Like one of my friends is Tamil, one of my friends being half Chinese, half white, another one of my friends being atheist, one of my gay friends. So basically people who grew up in these different groups within a majority group. And I just asked them to tell me about their story. And the one thing that I realized very quickly is I could not try to tell other people's stories or try to even fit it into mine. Because initially when I started writing, I'm like, do I want this to appeal to other people? And I realized, no, I can't do that. I can only write my authentic story. And I think when I chose to do that, that's when it became an easier process. And I think because I did that is why it resonated with other people.
Very interesting. So, and so tell us, how long did it take for you from that writing of bullet points up to a point where you actually were on camera and you actually got to a point where you were screening it?
Yeah, so let's see, the Facebook post went up in June of 2017, if I remember correctly, June of 2017. And then we decided to do the speaking tour of Newfoundland, which we were planning for September. At that point, that's when Nazia came up with the idea to actually make the documentary film. Initially, this was just going to be a speaking tour going around Newfoundland. And she said, let's do the film. So we said, how are we going to do this? Fortunately, we were able to meet this amazing director based out of Toronto. His name is Amar Walla. People might know him from his feature film he made called The Secret Trial 5, based on the Muslims who were held under security certificates after 9/11. But we actually met him when he came to the Calgary Film Festival, and we went out to dinner with him and some friends. And basically years later, we sent him this Facebook message saying, what do you think of this idea? And he loved it. So what we ended up doing was we got him on board and a film team. They joined us for this speaking tour going around Newfoundland, which happened at the end of September. And essentially, they went back into the production house and did all the editing. And we kind of had a little bit of back and forth. And it was fully completed by the new year. So it was all a pretty fast process, essentially 6 months to come out with the film.
Very interesting. That's very, it's quite rare actually. You know, from the time it is, you know, you put the pen on your paper, on a paper to a point where you actually are screening. That's actually pretty good timing, based on what you just mentioned. Now, a couple of things about the impact itself, and I'm glad you actually you mentioned why it spoke so well to others. Perhaps has to do with the fact that you were telling your own authentic story in your own words, in your own way. So, is there anything else you thought, based on the feedback you have received? Is there anything else you think that spoke so well to such a wide spectrum and diversity of people across Canada, which made it so interesting and engaging?
It's interesting. So, I mean, I've been working in the field of innovation and entrepreneurship for quite a while. And the one thing we always say, it's ideas never matter until you actually put it out there in the world and then you see where it lands. It's never actually about the idea. It's how the idea lands. And one thing that we found interesting is like this idea landed in different ways that we never even thought of. Like when we created this film, we thought, for example, it might appeal to one community, and then all of a sudden it was this other community that it like audience that it really appealed to. And then we ended up focusing there. So one example is when we initially created this film, we thought that the key audience would be essentially like Muslim Canadians in general, like the type of people we know. And then we ended up finding out, and it's not surprising, that the biggest audience and the biggest champions of films were actually like newcomer associations and organizations and people who assist newcomers coming in and settling in Canada. So when we toured across the country, a lot of it was steeped in audiences wrapped around newcomers and migration. And that's actually, even when we got connected into the United Nations, we were chosen by their International Office of Migration to screen this internationally, because they thought it resonated not just with migration in Canada, but migration in general, of how is it that people connect into communities that they move into, that they might not necessarily see themselves in that community. So because of that, we got to screen in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Europe, in a few other places as well. So that was something that was really interesting to see, like the community ended up gravitating towards it.
Do you think if you were a person happened to be born, let's say in Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal or any other metropolitan city, and if you did this film, do you think you would have gotten similar response?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, like, well, Nazia grew up in Toronto, but I know the story is kind of me in Newfoundland. I actually don't know if it would have. I'm not really sure. To give you an example, when we did our Canadian tour, we explicitly try to go to places that not many people go. And even the Muslim communities in those towns would call themselves the flyover places. So we went to places like Saskatchewan, the Yukon, like Atlantic Canada a lot, like PEI, Nova Scotia, where Muslims in those communities were like, you know what, no one ever really talks to us about what it's like to be a Muslim here. And then we actually had this interesting conversation of what is the Muslim Canadian narrative? And is there a group that owns that? Is there a group that should even own that? Or, because the one thing we got to appreciate a lot, which we always knew, is the diversity within Muslim Canadians, which is a beautiful thing. So that was another interesting learning that we had on the journey.
And I think that is the novelty of your, of your documentary. You are telling a story of an individual or family that is based in and rooted in Eastern Canada, culture. You grew up there, and what is, I think, interesting about that story is that you didn't just talk about it exclusively from a Muslim, Canadian Muslim or Newfoundlander experience, but you also sort of brought in the wider community there. And you talked about not just Islamophobia there and sort of the negative side or negative experiences, which of course most Muslim minorities and minorities out there, visible minorities sadly, and racialized communities face. But you also talked about success stories, and you talked about how that you talked about a very amazing real Canadian and Muslim integration story, which is often not told. So when you talk about usually when you talk about Islamophobia and combating hate, we often not talk about the other side of this, the story, which is, there are some amazing people who are also your allies. They're also with you. In fact, sometimes they're louder than you. Sometimes they're standing not only just with you, but they're in front of you, in fact, petitioning or protesting and doing some amazing things. So I think that's what also makes it so powerful. And I remember actually watching your documentary with my kids and my family almost 4 years back, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I remember it was a very different type of story. I was not expecting it, what I saw, and it was a it sparked some very interesting conversations. So thank you for doing that. So let's switch gears a little bit. I mean, there's a few.
You mind if I jump on that for a second? Because this is another thing that we learned on the journey, which is we faced critique for how we made this film and the story and the way that we said it. We faced, I mean, I've had racist people come at me, and that's kind of expected. I'm not too shocked from that. But we had people on the social justice side come at us as well, saying kind of like misinterpreting the film as trying to basically whitewash racism, saying like, is this like a kumbaya story, saying that everything is all great? And that's definitely not the point of what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to highlight how, and kind of like watching the film, me being my authentic Muslim self could exist in Newfoundland and be appreciated because I'm Muslim, not in spite of it. It was something where even when I hear things like the words integration, I'm actually not a big fan of the word integration. Yes. I think many people know why that is. Yes. But because when we talk about the film, we can actually tease out, why does that word, tease out that word integration, and why is it strange? Why does it not really hit on inclusion? So it's been an interesting journey in that way. And that kind of touches on my previous point of, we thought we knew what some of our audiences might have been, when in fact it was a different group as well. And we faced critiques at the same time. And that's one of the things I want to put out there that we can talk more about later. There's going to be, as soon as you put out an idea, whether it's good or bad, even if it's good, you're going to face critique on it. So how is it that you engage with that?
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. We really do need to hear behind the scenes stories of challenges that you face, and I'm sure there are many more. So thank you for sharing that. That's very, very important. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and I'll come back to some of elements of your story, especially related to this wonderful project that you, of course, have launched a few years ago. I want to hear about your work with Startup Edmonton, which is a program that provides support and courses for Black entrepreneurs. And you were a former director there. What led you to so many unique projects that are rooted in anti-racism efforts and education? This is one of those endeavors. So I wonder why something like this was important to you, and why you got into something like this.
Yeah, so Startup Edmonton, like many major cities across Canada, have technology startup incubators. So Startup Edmonton is the city's early stage tech incubator serving entrepreneurs across the entire community. I was fortunate to get the role of executive director of the organization, and It was really wonderful. We would work with entrepreneurs who basically came in with that seed of an idea in their head and help them through the pathway of putting it down on paper for the first time, then going in front of customers, then building out their product and building out a business model that worked, and that whole churn of the new entrepreneur. So when we talk about, for example, the program that we created to support Black entrepreneurs, me walking into this position, I knew that equity and inclusion was important to me. And the reason being is not just from a, like, of course, from a social justice standpoint, but it just makes sense. Like, if you really want to untap the blue ocean of human ingenuity in any community, you have to take equity seriously. If not, you're just harming yourself. So we went under the whole lens of our goal is to make Edmonton the most innovative entrepreneurial city that we can. How would we let discrimination and prejudice be a barrier to that? It just makes no sense whatsoever. So we actually wanted to take it head on. And the reason I want to flag that of taking it head on is because many community organizations, I mean, within your mandate, you might say, oh, we're going to serve everyone. Like, that's just like, you know, we're open, we're inclusive, we're going to serve everyone equally. But there's a difference between saying that and kind of going out and bringing the people in. Because as soon as you just say, oh yeah, we're open to serve everyone, you are vulnerable to the structural inequalities that the rest of your community faces, that is just present in society, which just exists. So what we did is we said, okay, let's actually go and engage groups. And rather than being open, let's be inviting. So we would actually go and invite groups. And we just decided to start with the Black entrepreneur community in Edmonton. This was shortly after the George Floyd murder happened in the US. We had one of our employees who was a community coordinator, a young Black woman, felt really affected by that. And bless her, she led the charge on architecting this. We actually set up roundtables with Black entrepreneurs in Edmonton, learned about their journey. We actually didn't have a program in mind when we walked into it. We just went in, developed relationships, and listened. And then we said, okay, we think we can do something here. Then we created the program. When we created the program, it actually, it's kind of interesting, from a registration perspective, it was the most successful program that we've ever made in terms of getting registration, because there was this huge vacuum, yet big community need. And from that, I mean, there were like failures and learnings in the program. Like, we learned like things we need to adjust with it, but we actually learned as we went to make the next version a bit better. And once we started with the Black community, that helped us figure out, okay, what is our process? We started engaging with the Indigenous community. And then after that, we started engaging with the LGBT community. So it just helped us engage more communities. And basically, we kind of built up like a learning machine inside of our organization of how is it that we can effectively learn about communities that are underserved by us. Like, we are the problem here. Like, there's nothing wrong with the community. We are the ones who are underserving them. How is it we can build up a learning machine to figure out how we can serve them better? Because that's our job to do. So whenever we talk about equity and inclusion and people would say, like, why do you do this? How do you do it? I was like, well, we just did our job. Like, that's really what it is.
Awesome. That's amazing. Well, I mean, let's talk about your new role. I mean, you're the newly minted CEO of the Northpine Foundation. Tell us about what this amazing amazing organization is about. And of course, I mean, as whatever little I know, it is an organization that invests in marginalized communities and underserved communities across Canada. So tell us, what are you doing now with this new role at this wonderful organization?
Yeah, so I just started in as the CEO of the Northpine Foundation at the beginning of January. And it's interesting because this is kind of like a startup foundation. It's really starting from scratch, but we actually hold the capacity to be one of the largest foundations in Canada. And essentially, the whole area that we're trying to target is really taking this innovative lens to social impact, but to be honest, like to get past all the buzzwords, what it's really about is how do we again serve underserved communities better? How is it that we, with our resources, can invest in so-called riskier ideas or ideas that don't necessarily get tried out by other organizations for very legitimate reasons? I mean, in some cases, other organizations might not be able to take the risk. They might not have the ability to invest in those ideas. So how is it that we can be, again, that learning machine, that testing ground that can test out a variety of ideas to serve a specific community, figure out what works, what doesn't work. Like, don't be afraid to say that an idea doesn't work. That's also fine to do. So our goal is to kind of make this foundation in such a way that, and I would say like the geographic scope is Canada. And how is it that we can make it into this machine that figures out innovative ways for social impact for marginalized communities? Oh, I should correct the note. Not largest startup in North America, but one of the largest private foundations in Canada. So I just had to put that correction. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting, but it's very much steeped in this idea of how is it that we are connected to the community that we're trying to serve and invest in ideas that make the most sense for them, even if they're risky.
It's interesting to see that this, I guess, our generation and the younger generation, coming up and coming generation of Canadians and Canadian Muslims are looking beyond relief and looking beyond sort of temporary measures and handouts and looking at something that is long-term and empowering, which is where the idea of social enterprise, of course, comes in. And that's what you seem to be, of course, very passionate about, developing sustainable business models that are not-for-profit in nature to empower other communities, basically, and especially the underserved and marginalized communities, racialized communities that don't get those kinds of opportunities. So I'm very, very happy and excited to actually hear not only your trajectory through your career, but specifically now, of course, with this new program that you are leading. So really wishing you all the best with that. You mentioned actually a couple of times learning from our failures, and you're talking about, of course, in the context of an organization. But let's talk about learning from your own failures in other creative endeavors, like specifically Salaam B'y project. I remember earlier, before the show, you mentioned something about you and your wife had some failures, and there's one specific one that led to actually this interesting idea of the film itself. Tell us a little bit about that particular failure that actually led you to doing a film instead of doing something else that you were thinking of initially.
Yeah, so my wife Nazia always says that this was her like favorite failure of Salaam B'y, and it was fantastic. Is when we first created this story and we got Amar on board, which Amar is a fantastic filmmaker, highly reputable. We actually pitched it to CBC at first because we know CBC funds Canadian content, and CBC actually rejected it. And that was actually one of our favorite failures because it actually forced us to think differently about how we're going to do this. And there's multiple reasons of why that's a great failure. I mean, CBC has their own approaches to how they frame Canadian content. So rather, we started crowdfunding. And of course, as much as like you go through a failure and you have to take a new path, that new uncharted path can be kind of worrisome. So when we started crowdfunding, we're like, ooh, can we even make $1,000? That would be amazing if we could get that. And we ended up making $15,000 from 270 donors from 19 different countries in less than 30 days. And that funded the creation of this film. So that really blew our mind, because once we did the crowdfunding, that actually allowed us to have more creative freedom with how we wanted to make the film and tell the story, and not necessarily go specifically by CBC's approach of storytelling, which we think worked out quite well. So it's not to say, like, you know, of course, dealing with a failure is one hit. Then having to go down a different pathway is kind of, you know, it's a bit of anxiety there because you're not sure how it's going to go. We're not sure if crowdfunding is going to work. But I would say the biggest learning there is, do you have the team that's willing to go on that roller coaster with you? Because no matter what, like I said before, even when you're an entrepreneur, the world doesn't necessarily care about your idea. It's how the idea lands and how you move around and navigate with it. So you have the kind of team that can be agile and adaptive, because that's really what a successful idea will come from. It's not like the idea is never going to be the best when it's just in your head. It's when you throw it out there in the world, and then you have to deal with all the other mess that comes with it, and you have to work within that.
And I think part of that failure story is the fact that, interestingly, how CBC then invited you guys back to talk about your story and featured it on radio. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's so then CBC did a fantastic national radio documentary on us.
Very interesting. You know, this is a story of actually a lot of creative people, which is very interesting. And you know, and I'm actually fascinated to hear, you know, how it was one of those idle mornings or evenings you decided to start putting stuff on paper, and here we are today. You're doing tours and winning awards because of it. It's just phenomenal what boredom does to you, and especially this pandemic boredom. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for many of us to explore our own stories and how we can tell our stories. So speaking of that, what advice do you have for people? First of all, to people who really don't think their stories matter, and why they should tell their story.
Yeah, and this is something like, so as we toured across Canada, Nazi and I, we would have two key audiences. One was general community screenings, and another one was schools. We did school screenings and engagement in every city we went to. And we talked a lot to high school kids and younger who would ask this question. And I think the biggest thing that we got out of this is, you know, not everyone has to be a storyteller. That's fine. Sometimes your stories are told through the work that you do in different ways. And that is something that we celebrate a lot. So it's actually the two big things we talk about is engage everything in your life with that, like ihsan and ikhlas, that sincerity and that excellence, in such a way that you living your life is telling that story of who you were in such a way that it resonates, and that Noor resonates to other people. So that's kind of one way I want to talk about it, because I don't want people necessarily to think that the only way of telling your story is like physically writing and telling your story. There's many ways that you tell your story and how you interact with society. But for those people who are interested in like the creative ways of telling your story, I would say, like I said, I had to sit down on a computer and write out everything on my mind and put it into 30 pages of bullet points. But I think the key thing was how to be authentic to yourself when you're going through that process. Trying to think of, who are you telling this story for? Who are you telling it on behalf of? Can you even tell this story on behalf of other people? As I mentioned, when I spoke to my other friends who grew up in Newfoundland. And then the final piece is the knowing the right balance of what I call the production versus consumption. It's very easy to consume other people's stories and other people's content, which is good, important. It can help inform your own creativity. But then at some point, it's all about just encouraging people to produce their own. Even if you feel like it's not that great, that is completely fine. It's all an experimental process. You could produce anything. And I really value that process of production. So rather than kind of just sitting back, consuming, talking about what other people are producing, just trying to come up with something on your own, whatever that might be. And it's interesting because once you do that, you start to engage with this community and this like supportive community who is out there that can help you on this journey of producing whatever it is that you want, whether it's a written piece, whether it's artwork, whether it's film. Once you start producing and people see your drive behind it, you tend to connect with this community of supporters.
Mm. Well, that's a beautiful advice, actually. Now, you wear many hats. You are a tech expert. You are a social entrepreneur. You are very involved with anti-racism education, interfaith work and dialogue, all of that amazing stuff. I wanted to know what keeps you going on a daily basis. What are your motivations? You get up in the morning. What pushes you to keep doing what you keep doing?
My wife is a big one. Yeah. I
That's
always
beautiful.
say, it's I joke around with some of my friends. It's like, I have this person who's with me every day, who believes in me more than I will ever believe in myself, who encourages me more than I could ever encourage myself. I'm just like, oh my goodness, like this is, sometimes I don't even know what to do with it, because the amount of empowerment that she gives me to do everything is probably one of the most important things for me. And then along with that is my family, my parents. Like, they're always so encouraging. I always like to fight the trope of, like, we always see the trope in like particularly like brown or communal culture communities of parents forcing their kids to do stuff. And sure, it happens in families as well. But like, both my wife and I, we just kind of have the parents that really just empower us and support us to do whatever it is that we want to do, as long, but they can, and it's not just saying that kind of let you do whatever, but like really have that drive for excellence in what you do. And I think that's something that's really powerful. And that kind of trust that I have from the people around me, and that belief that the people around me put in me, I'm really blessed. Like, they kind of give me the fuel even when I never even asked for it. So it's I think that's a big one. And then the other piece is I'm just a giant nerd. I have fun with this stuff. I enjoy it. It's kind of funny. I remember one time in a job interview, people, like, they have one of those like general questions, like, what do you do for fun? And, you know, people might be like, oh yeah, like, I like to ski, I like to bake, whatever the case may be. I was like, you know what? Like, what I do for fun is I talk to my friends who work in social impact and nonprofit organizations, and I try to figure out their business models, because I think that excites me. I get so excited by that. I do like cooking, and it's fun, but it's like, I'm just a big nerd. Like, I just love that kind of stuff of just trying to figure out how to take amazing ideas and scale them out. So those are some of the things that I find really empower me. And then I find that my faith kind of really keeps me grounded, which is always very, I can't stress how important that is. Like, you know, when you're down in sujood with your head on the floor, like, there's something so important about those moments that also keeps you going. It kind of, it's the Gatorade that fills your cup.
Well, let's speak of that. It's actually interesting. You mentioned, you brought up spirituality and your faith. I mean, from your perspective, what kind of spiritual motivation do you get to do the social justice kind of work that you're doing?
I think there's a few things. There's some selfish things for it. Like, it makes me feel good to do it. Not in a way of like kind of like a savior complex, but I just enjoy it. I enjoy the work. The other piece is like, what else would I be doing with my time? You're only given so much time on this earth, and I have fun with this. And from what I know, it's valuable to my faith. So it just seems like it's kind of like a no-brainer to me. It's kind of like the why not idea. What else would I be doing? So yeah, I think those are the key pieces. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's my whole goal in life, inshallah, is to get to heaven one day. And there's many pathways to it, and everyone on this planet is trying to figure it out as they go. So I'm just trying to figure it out as I go. I'm not the best Muslim. I don't know everything there is, but I'm on this path.
MashaAllah. And that is the spirit. I think that's so critical that we need to have, is having that bigger goal that is beyond this world in mind, and doing our best here to uplift ourselves and uplift our communities in whatever ways and capacities we have. So this is very beautiful to hear from you. Now, as we conclude, I wanted to hear from you 3 pieces of advice you would give to a young person, a young aspiring entrepreneur, social entrepreneur like yourself, who wants to, who may have an idea, maybe hasn't landed yet, and wants to change the world in some big or small way. So what advice would you give? 3 pieces of advice, ideally, to a young social up and coming entrepreneur, social entrepreneur in this area.
Yeah, I think that the first piece is go and start small. Start very small. I know, and this is kind of the opposite of what people might say. Like, people may say, oh, like, think big. But to be honest, I am much more on the think small, in the sense of, because you have to put it in such a way that you actually start with something. So start extremely small. Also know that when you actually start down this road, there's going to be some people who are helpful, some people who might not be as helpful. So kind of, you kind of learn how to build up that community of support around you once you start small. And once you build up that community of support and you start small, it's actually what I tell every entrepreneur that I work with is, don't fall in love with your idea until the problem you're trying to solve falls in love with your idea. It doesn't matter how much you love your idea. It's, does the problem you're trying to solve love your idea? So there's a process in figuring that out. And it actually starts with the starting small, putting it out there, seeing if the problem you're solving actually resonates with your idea. And what you find is your idea changes over time. So that's why I say don't fall in love with it, because it's probably going to change over time. But fall in love with the problem you're trying to solve, not necessarily the idea. Because if you're in love with the problem you're trying to solve, then you realize that, there could be many ideas that help solve that problem in the best way. And then you become more adaptive and more agile.
I think this is one of the most amazing piece of advice I've heard in a while. Fall in love with the idea you're trying to solve. Fall in love with the problem you're trying to solve, not the idea itself, which is very amazing. Well, thank you so much, Aatif. And as we conclude, in fact, how can people know more about the wonderful work you're doing with Salaam B'y or any other initiatives? Is there a website you would recommend people to go to, or anything else you want to share with us?
Yeah, so you can go to salamb'y.ca, and there you will find that we have the film and the teacher's guide we've actually made available for free for any teachers or community organizations in Canada. So you see that there's an online form you can fill out to get access to the film and all the anti-racism teaching resources that we have there. You can also find us on Facebook. We have a page, Salaam B'y, a story of a Muslim Newfoundlander. Aside from that, for people who are very passionate about social innovation, you can also find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, well, awesome. Look forward to having more conversations with you in the future about so many incredible themes that we just touched upon today and couldn't do too much justice to, but we just wanted to hear your story and your path, your career path, your personal path to a lot of wonderful things that you're up to and the impact that you're making. So keep it up. And we look forward to hearing more from you in the near future. So thank you so much, Aatif, for your time and your inspiration this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Taha. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, folks, this is a wrap. Unfortunately, we couldn't talk more. There's a lot of more amazing content we could cover in the near future. So stay tuned for more interesting conversations with changemakers like Aatif Baskanderi in the near future. If you have any ideas, as usual, please do reach out to us for stories or inspirational people whom we should be inviting to Canada today. Wanted to also end by thanking our wonderful team of production, including Saliha Farouk and Aisha Malik. With that, I would like to sign off. This is Taha Ghayur on Canada Today, watching on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.